Okay, this is part 24 of Nos4a2. The other end of the bridge. Insects made a sawing noise off in the high brush. In New Hampshire, spring had been a cold, mucky slog, but here, wherever here was, the air was warm and breezy. At the edge of her vision, Vic saw flashes of light, glimmers of brightness out in the trees, but in those first few moments she didn't give it any thought. Vic slipped off the bridge and onto firmly packed dirt. She braked to a stop, put her foot down. She turned her head to look back into the bridge. The shorter way had settled among trees to one side of the house. It stretched back and away through the hard woods. When she peered through it, she saw Haverhill on the other end, green and shadowy in the late light of afternoon. The house, a white Cape Cod, stood alone at the end of a long dirt lane. The grass grew waist-high in the yard. Sumac had invaded from the trees, growing in bunches as tall as Vic herself. The shades were drawn behind the windows, and the screens were rested and bellied out, and there was no car in the drive and no reason to think anyone was home. But Vic was immediately afraid of the place and did not believe that it was empty. It was an awful place, and her first thought was that when the police searched it, they would find bodies buried in the backyard. When she had entered the bridge, she had felt like she was soaring, effortlessly as a hawk carried on an updraft. She had felt she was gliding and that no harm could come to her. Even now, standing still, she felt like she was moving, sailing forward, but the sensation was no longer pleasant. Now it felt like she was being pulled toward something she didn't want to know about. From somewhere came the faint sound of a TV or a radio. Vic looked back against the bridge. It was only a couple feet away. She exhaled deeply, told herself she was safe. If she was seen, she could wheel the bike around, get back into the bridge, and be gone before anyone had time to so much as shout. She got off the bike and began to walk it forward. With each soft, crunching footfall, she felt more sure that her surroundings were real, not a delusion engineered by ecstasy. The radio sounds grew in volume by subtle degrees as she approached the cottage. Looking out into the trees, Vic saw those glimmering lights again. Slivers of brightness hung in the surrounding pines. It took a moment to make sense of what she was seeing, and when she did, she held up and stared. The firs around the house were hung with Christmas ornaments, hundreds of them, dangling from dozens of trees. Great silver and gold spears, dusted with glitter, swayed in the drifting pine branches. Tin angels held silent trumpets to their lips. Fat Santas had chubby fingers to their mouths, advising Vic to proceed quietly. As she stood there looking about, that radio sound resolved into the bluff baritone of Burl Ives, encouraging all the world to have a holly jolly Christmas, and never mind it was the third week of March. The voice was coming from the attached garage, a dingy building with a single roll-up door and 4 square windows with looking into it, milky with filth. She took one baby step, then a second, creeping toward the garage in the same way she might creep out onto a high ledge. On the third step, she looked back to make sure the bridge was still there and that she could get into it in a hurry if she had to. She could. Another step and a fifth, and then she was close enough to see through one of the grimy windows. Vic leaned her Raleigh against the wall to one side of the big garage door. She pressed her face up to the glass. The garage contained an old black car with a small rear window. It was a Rolls-Royce, the kind of car Winston Churchill was always getting out of in his photographs and old films. She could see the license plate Nos4a2. That's it. That's all you need. The police can track him down with that, Vic thought. You have to go now. You have to run. But as she was about to step away from the garage, she saw movement through the rear window of the old car. Someone sitting in the back seat shifted slightly, wiggling to find a more comfortable spot. Vic could dimly see the outline of a small head through the foggy glass. A child. There was a child in the car. A boy, she thought. The kid had a boy's haircut. Vic's heart was by now beating so hard her shoulders shook. He had a child in his car, and if Vic rode back across the shorter way, maybe the law would catch up to the man who owned this old ride, and they would not find the kid with him, because by then he would already be under a foot of dirt somewhere. Vic didn't know why the child didn't scream or let himself out of the car and run. Maybe he was drugged or tied up. Vic couldn't tell. Whatever the reason, he wasn't getting out unless Vic went in there and got him out. She drew back from the glass and took another look over her shoulder. The bridge waited amid the trees. It suddenly seemed a long way off. How had it gotten so far away? Vic left the Raleigh, went around to the side of the garage. She expected the side doors to be locked, but when she turned the handle, it popped open. Quivering, high-pitched, helium-stoked voices spilled out, Alvin and the Chipmunks singing their infernal Christmas song. Her heart quailed at the thought of going in there. She put one foot over the threshold tentatively, as if stepping onto the ice of a pond that might not yet be safely frozen over. The old car, obsidian and sleek, filled almost all the available space in the garage. What little room was left was jammed into clutter. Paint cans, rakes, ladders, boxes. The rolls had a roomy rear compartment, the back couch done in flesh-toned kid skin. A boy slept upon it. He wore a rawhide jacket with buttons of bone. He had dark hair and a round, fleshy face, his cheeks touched with a rose bloom of health. He looked as if he were dreaming sweet dreams, visions of sugar plums, perhaps. He wasn't tied up in any way and didn't look unhappy, and Vic had a thought that made no sense. He's fine. You should go. He's probably here with his father, and he fell asleep, and his father is letting him rest, and you should just go away. Vic flinched from the thought the way she might have flinched from a horsefly. There was something wrong with that thought. It had no business in her head, and she didn't know how it had got there. The Shorterway Bridge had brought her here to find the Wraith, a bad man who hurt people. She had gone looking for trouble, and the bridge never pointed her wrong. In the last few minutes, things she had suppressed for years had come surging back. Maggie Lee had been real, not a daydream. Vic really had gone out on her bike and retrieved her mother's bracelet from Terry's Primo Subs that had not been imagined but accomplished. She tapped on the glass. The child did not stir. He was younger than her, 12 or thereabouts. There was a faint, dusky wisp of hair on his upper lip. "Hey!" she called out to him in a low voice. "Hey, kid!" He shifted, but only to roll onto his side so his face was turned away from her. Vic tried the door. It was locked from the inside. The steering wheel was on the right side of the car, the side she was already on. The driver's side window was rolled most of the way down. Vic shuffled toward it. There wasn't much space between the car and the clutter piled against the wall. The keys were in it, the car running off the battery. The face of the radio was lit, a radioactive shade of green. Vic didn't know who was singing now, some old Vegas dude. But it was another one about Christmas. Christmas was almost 3 months in the rearview mirror, and there was something awful about Christmas music when it was nearly summer. It was like a clown in the rain with his makeup running. "Hey, kid," she hissed. "Hey, kid, wake up." The boy moved slightly, and then he sat up and turned to face her. Vic saw his face and had to bite back a cry. It wasn't anything like the face she had seen through the rear window. The boy in the car looked close to death, or beyond death. His face was lunar in its paleness, except for the hollows of his eyes, which were bruise-colored. Black, poisoned veins crawled beneath his skin as if his arteries were filled with ink, not blood, and erupted in sick branches at the corners of his mouth and eyes and in his temples. His hair was the color of frost on a window pane. He blinked. His eyes were shiny and curious, the one part of him that seemed fully alive. He exhaled, white smoke, as if he stood in a freezer. "Who are you?" he asked, each word a new puff of white vapor. "You shouldn't be here." "Why are you so cold?" "I'm not," he said. "You should go. It isn't safe here." His breath steaming. "Oh, God, kid," she said. "Let's get you out of here. Come on, come with me." "I can't unlock my door." "So climb into the front seat," she said. "I can't," he said again. He spoke like one sedated, and it came to Vic that he had to be drugged. Could a drug lower your body temperature enough to make your breath steam? She didn't think so. I can't leave the back seat. You really shouldn't be here. He'll come back soon." White frozen air trickled from his nostrils. Vic heard him clearly enough, but didn't understand much of it, except for the last bit. "He'll come back soon" made perfect sense. Of course he was coming back, whoever he was, the Wraith. He wouldn't have left the car running off the battery if he weren't going to be back soon, and she had to be gone by the time he returned. They both did. She wanted more than anything to take off, to bolt for the door, tell the kid she would come back with police, but she could not go. If she ran, she would not just be leaving a sick and abducted child behind, she would be abandoning her own best self too. She reached to the window and unlocked the front door and swung it open. "Come on," she said, "take my hand." She reached over the back of the driver's seat into the rear compartment. He looked into her palm for a moment, his gaze thoughtful, as if he were attempting to read her future, or as if she had offered him a chocolate and he was trying to decide whether he wanted it. That was the wrong way for a kidnapped child to react, and she knew it, but she still didn't pull her hand back in time. He gripped her wrist, and she screamed at his touch. His hand, blazing under her skin, was as bad as pressing her wrist to a hot frying pan. It took her an instant to register the sensation not as heat, but as cold. The horn sounded with a great blast. In the confined space of the garage, the noise was almost too much to bear. Vic didn't know why it went off. She hadn't touched the steering wheel. "Let go, you're hurting me," she said. "I know," he said. When he smiled, she saw that his mouth was full of little hooks, rows of them, each as small and delicate as a sewing needle. The rows of them seemed to go all the way down his throat. The horn sounded again. The boy raised his voice and shouted, "Mr. Mannix! Mr. Mannix! I caught a girl! Mr. Mannix, come see!" Vic braced a foot against the driver's seat and threw herself backward, thrusting hard with her leg. The boy was yanked forward. She didn't think he was going to let go. His hand felt as if it were fused to her wrist, his skin frozen to hers. But when she drew her hand back across the rear divider into the front seat, he released her. She fell back into the steering wheel and the horn went off again. Her fault this time. The boy hopped up and down on the rear seat in excitement. "Mr. Mannix! Mr. Mannix! Come see the pretty girl!" Vapor extruded from his nostrils and mouth. Vic dropped out of the driver's side door and onto the concrete. Her shoulders hit a mess of stacked rakes and snow shovels, and they fell over on top of her with a crash. The horn went off again and again in a series of deafening blasts. Vic shoved the lawn tools off her. When she was on her knees, she looked at her wrist. It was hideous, a black burn in the rough shape of a child's hand. She slammed the driver's side door, took one last glance at the boy in the back seat. His face was eager, glistening with excitement. A black tongue lolled out of his mouth and rolled around his lips. "Mr. Mannix, she's running away!" he screamed, his breath frosted over the windowed glass. "Come see! Come see!" She picked herself up and took one clumsy, off-balance step back toward the side door to the yard. The motor that ran the electric garage door roared to life, the chain overhead pulling it up with a grinding clatter. Vic caught herself, then began going back fast as she could. The big garage door rose and rose, revealing black boots, silver-gray trousers, and she thought, "The Wraith! It's the Wraith!" Vic lurched around the front of the car. 2 steps led up to a door that she knew would open into the house itself. The knob turned. The door eased back onto darkness. Vic stepped through and pushed the door shut behind her and began to move across.